Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on April 20th with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Crossing the Border, Finding Your Immigrant Ancestors. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on using the timeline grid to build your tree. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Kathryn. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn began doing family history. Somewhat to her surprise, she discovered that she loved it. Her specialty is helping new family historians find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library and presents at other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the New Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. In addition, she's a regular contributor to the Family Search blog. Kathryn works as a technical writer and instructional designer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Her current work assignment includes in developing training used on mobile devices. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and fresh raspberries. And if Kathryn is ready, we can go ahead and turn the time over to her.
Sounds great. Olivia, thank you so much. And you should now be able to see the screen. So welcome everybody to this class on the timeline grid. I am so excited to share these things with you today. Some of you, I suspect, are attending because you've used the timeline grid in the past or have maybe watched other webinars about it. So this actually will be a very practical webinar. It will build on those other webinars, but you don't have to have seen them in order for this to be helpful. In fact, we're going to do a quick review of the timeline grid and then provide a link if you're interested in more information. So let's look at what's on our schedule today. First of all, our little review. What is the timeline grid? And then we'll talk about 3 good reasons to use the timeline grid to build your tree. After that, we will have a walkthrough. Actually, it'll be pretty high level, pretty conceptual, but it should be something that you can apply across many different situations, time periods, countries, that type of thing. And then finally, we will end up with questions and wrap up. So let's dive in. First of all, what is the timeline grid? Well, here it is. You're looking at it on the screen. And essentially, it is a table that you either create or you copy from a template. It centers on one family, so a set of parents and their children. I used to try to make them multi-generational, and it just turned into like this big tangled ball of yarn. It just didn't work very well. So I started just doing one family at a time and then linking grids to each other, and I'll show you an example of that. And it's most useful in countries and time periods that have regular censuses. So in a nutshell, the timeline grid shows key family information organized in a compact space. Here is an example of a completed timeline grid, and I just want to call out a few of the features. So at the top of the timeline grid, usually you'll want to put the parents and also your relatives' parents at the top. So for example, Ann Gunton here is my relative. I was actually doing descendancy research. She married Thomas Guy, and I have so many Ann Guntons on my line, as you might imagine. I'll bet a lot of you have the similar thing where you have a lot of people with the same name. And I thought I've got to just put some context here so that I recognize what family I'm talking about. And so I put Ann's parents as well. The first column of the timeline grid is typically used for identifying information such as the name, the family tree PID, vital information such as the birth, that kind of thing. And then all the other columns are used for censuses. So we've got 71, 81, 91. These, of course, are English censuses. Canada would be the same with censuses on the 1 year. In the United States, censuses are on the 0 year. So it would have been 1870, 1880, of course, skipping 1890 to go to 1900 and so forth. So there are templates for these, and I'll be showing you how to get those templates at the end. And they're all totally free. Like this is nothing to do with upselling or cost or whatever. They're just free templates. So all the columns are used for other censuses, and each person gets their own row. And I've also seen people try to put multiple people in a row, and that also gets to be really challenging because it's harder to read. I think that's the biggest reason. So you'll find if you put one person per row, that's going to make it a lot easier to read and to use your timeline grids. A couple of other features to call out. You can use colors as visual cues. So here, for example, William Carter Guy has left home. He's working on a nearby farm, but he hasn't started his own family yet. So he doesn't really need his own grid, but I wanted it to be very obvious when I looked at this grid that he wasn't living with his parents in this particular census. So I colored it orange, and you can, of course, color it any color you want. But here we see that here's the enumeration information for William, and so it corresponds to his information down here. And of course, his parents, I just kept them the same color as before. And then when William got married to Mary Jane Norman, who actually ended up being the farmer's daughter on the farm where he was working, when they started their own family, I created a separate grid for them and then created a link from here to that new grid for William and Mary Jane. Did I say Mary Ann? If I said that, I meant Mary Jane. So William and Mary Jane, they get their own grid. So that is a summary of the timeline grid and kind of how it's laid out. If you're interested in more information, including free templates and also some training, please feel free to visit this URL here, goldenrodgenealogy.com/timeline_grid.htm. And so that, and I think at the end, usually in the past, Olivia has been great about putting links on the YouTube page. So Olivia is totally unscripted here, but if you don't mind, later I could send you this link and maybe you could add it to the YouTube page so it's available for everybody. That would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that is our little review of the timeline grid. Now let's talk about 3 reasons that the timeline grid can be helpful to you when you are trying to build your tree. The first reason is that it's really helpful in organizing information. So it helps you turn. Do you ever feel like when you're doing family history that you're trying to put a lot of puzzle pieces together? I think a lot of us can relate to that. And sometimes it does seem like this huge jumble, right, of puzzle pieces. Well, the timeline grid can help you turn that jumble into something more readable and usable. You start to put the puzzle together. Now, it's not magic, all the pieces won't immediately fall into place, but it's a tool that helps you make good progress. Another thing the timeline grid can do for you, excuse me, I've got to get a drink of water here. Another thing that the timeline grid can do for you is improve accuracy. And there's a lot of ways it does that, but I wanted to call out 3 specific things. So as I've worked in Family Tree and before that, New Family Search, some of you may have used that prior to 2012. One of the biggest challenges that I see is that so often we kind of take a random approach to our family history. So we might attach 1 or 2 sources, but not all the sources, or we might put 1 or 2 children, but we don't really try to find all the children. Or do you see what I'm saying? We kind of take this haphazard, a random approach, but we're working in a shared tree. And so when we take a haphazard random approach, that actually has an impact on other users because they come to some stuff we've been working on and they don't know what we were thinking. And so a lot of people assume everything is complete and correct when it isn't. Or if somebody comes and they go, wait a minute, that couple only has 2 children. I'm sure they had more. And then they kind of have to repeat the research that somebody else has already done. So to take a systematic approach using the timeline grid helps you build a much more complete picture. And anytime you have a more complete picture, it's going to be more accurate. Another thing I love about the timeline grid is that it provides context and it helps you avoid one of the single biggest problems in family tree, which is what we can call the same name trap. And that is assuming that 2 different people are the same person just because they have the same name. But if you look closely, they really aren't the same person. This same name trap has resulted in so many bad merges and other problems in family tree. Well, if you build out your timeline grid, you have context that helps you avoid those problems. So for instance, you might run across a Thomas guy and an Ann in the tree, but maybe they're from Yorkshire. Well, because you've built out this grid and you say, wait a second, this Thomas and Ann are from Cambridgeshire, and the other one's from Yorkshire, and so they're probably not the same person. And so that context can help you avoid lots of the common mistakes. And then also the timeline grid helps you see contradictions so that you can address them. So an example here is that we've got Thomas, who's born in Maine, but then he says he's born in Doddington, but then he says he's born in Maine, but then he says he's born in Doddington. So he kind of switches back and forth over the years, and that could be a red flag. So I have built timeline grids where the difference in birthplace was a red flag and it meant that I'd made a mistake. But as I looked at this one, the wife lines up, the residences all line up, the kids line up. We can only see William, but they had more kids. And so based on all the other information, I feel like this is really accurate. And when I used Google Maps to look up Doddington and Maine, they're within 5 miles of each other. So I kind of wonder if Thomas didn't do what a lot of us do, is if we were born in some tiny place that nobody knows about, but it's next to a larger city, they might say, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Salt Lake. And you don't say, well, I'm from Cottonwood Heights or whatever, because nobody knows, or very few people, unless you're in the area, know where that is. And so I'm kind of wondering if from census to census, he maybe forgot what he said 10 years earlier and sometimes just gave the name of the next largest city to where he was born. But I do feel satisfied because of the other information in the grid that we've got the right guy. The last thing that the timeline grid can do for you is to help you follow a key family history principle, and that is to use what you know to discover what you don't know. And that whenever I get lost when I'm doing family history, it's because I've forgotten that principle. So we're actually going to see how that principle comes into play as we do our walkthrough. So let's go ahead and start that. Before we get into specifics, I wanted to give you the overall process of building your tree with the timeline grid, 4 simple steps. So the first thing that you want to do is choose a starting person in your tree. The next thing that you do after that is to review that person's page. So you look at their information, focus on their sources, and then once you've got a good handle on everything you do know about that person, then it's time to start looking for other things, other historical records and so forth. And then you start adding that information to the timeline grid. Then, once you've completed the grid, you review the information for any contradictions or problems, and you resolve any issues that you find. And once you've got a clean grid, then you're ready to add the information to Family Tree or whatever family history program you're using. We'll use Family Tree for our example today, but it works equally well for Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest or a personal tree on Ancestry, wherever you're building your tree. And then, of course, we don't want to forget the final step, which is always to attach those sources. So let's walk through each of those steps. So step one is to choose that starting person in your tree. And honestly, of all the people that I've helped over the years, both as I was a consultant in my warden stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so I helped many people that way, but then also helped people through my work as a family history missionary with the BYU Family History Library. And this is, without exception, one of the hardest steps. Isn't that crazy? But it seriously is. Finding a starting place can be one of the most challenging things in your tree. So let's look at some ways that you can find a starting place. So first of all, now let me back up for a second. So if your tree is empty, for instance, you're just barely starting and seriously, nobody's done your family history. You go into Family Tree and there's just you. Actually, that's an ideal situation because then you can plug in your parents, you can plug in your grandparents. Most people will know. There are exceptions, but most people will know at least one or two generations back. And then you can start building the tree from there. But what if you open your tree and it looks super full? What do you do then? Well, there's three things that you can look for to find a place to build your tree. One is to look for people that don't have any parents. Another is to look for adults without spouses. And the reason I specified adults there is if you find a child that lived, say, from 1863 to 1865, just 2 years old, then you're not going to be needing to look for a spouse for them. But if you don't see any evidence of a death or you see evidence that they lived to adulthood, but they don't have a spouse, then you can start looking for a spouse. And finally, you can keep your eyes open for couples that have few or no children. So that's the what. What about the how? Well, as you'll see in the example, the walkthrough we're going to do, the way I found the person that we're going to be working on today was that his family got badly mangled with another family. So his parents were named George and Susanna Hood, and they were from Yorkshire. But there was another family with parents, George and Susanna Hood, but they were from Worcestershire. And somebody had come in and had seen the names and had assumed they were the same, had not looked at the places, and had entirely done multiple merges to merge the two families all together. So they were just a mangled mess. The parents had all been merged. The kids, they were showing that they had, I don't know, 14 kids or something because the kids had all been mangled from these two families. And so as I undid the problems, I started to notice, hey, there's some kids here that don't have spouses. So let me write that down so that I can look at this later and see if I can find spouses. So that's one thing to do is as you're working on other lines, keep track of people in these situations. Also, if your tree is full, you can try descendancy research. For those of you who may not be familiar with that, descendancy research, you do that by finding an ancestor and then tracing all their descendants. So if you've got a full tree, that is a great way to build out your tree. Essentially, you're working on all your cousins. They're like, fifth cousins, 2 times removed. But if you love family history and you want to build your tree, why not? But who cares if they're distant cousins? We want everybody to be included. So descendancy research is a great way to find starting places. You can also use a tool like Pozilla or Virtual Pedigree. You can scan your tree with those tools and find adults that don't have spouses or couples that don't have very many kids, that type of thing. And those of you who have been to my classes before know that I value my faith really highly. I'm a person of faith, and so prayer, I found that that really works. And so if you're also a person of faith, give prayer a try. But even if you're not, people talk about listening to your intuition or your inner voice or whatever. I found in family history that is a huge benefit to listen to that inner guidance. So all of those things can help you find a starting place. So our starting place for today is Thomas Hood. Let's get to know him a little bit. He was born in 1836 in Bradford, Yorkshire. And as we look down at you can probably envision we're scrolling down the page to the family member section in Family Tree, and we see he has no spouse. And here's his parents and all his siblings. So we have just completed step one. Choose a starting person. There's our Thomas Hood, and we're ready to build the timeline grid. So the first thing we want to do on step two is to review the sources that are attached to our Thomas Hood. Well, as it happens, there's only one source attached. Excuse me. And it happens to be the 1841 census. So as we look at the information, it lines up really well with the information that we already know about Thomas. So he's age 5 in 1841, which puts him born about 1836, which is what we expected. He's living in Bradford, Yorkshire, which also fits with his birthplace. And then as we look down the source, these are the people that are listed on the source. Dad, George, Mom, Susanna, and then all the kids. Well, notice that matches up perfectly with everybody in Family Tree. So this source is clearly a very good source. It is a good documentation, provides good documentation for everybody that we've got in the tree so far. So the next step, whenever I enter information into a timeline grid, I try to use an original source if possible, rather than going off the index, just because, as you've probably discovered as well, the index for a source can often have mistakes. When I say index, I mean the transcribed part. So, and a lot of them are really, really good, but there are a fair amount of errors. So I always try to bring up the image, and let me show you how I like to do that. So first of all, let me back up a second. First of all, I open a blank timeline grid, a blank template. And so there are templates for the United States and Canada and England. And if there's ever a demand for other templates, please send me an email and we'll make other templates for other countries. But so far, those have been the ones that have been requested the most. So for this family, because they're from England, I opened up the England version of the timeline grid. And so now this is what I wanted to mention. I love Ancestry's suggested records and their interface. After using other websites, I find that they are usually the easiest and the fastest for building a timeline grid. And so you may already have an Ancestry account, but if you don't, you can go to any family search center and they have an institutional Ancestry account that you can use at no charge. So what I do is I click the logo, the Ancestry link here under search records. And let me point out too, I think sometimes this is one of the best kept secrets. All these websites under search records are actually links, but they're not just links. If you click any of them, they will grab the information off the page and use it to run a search in whatever site you pick. Like, how cool is that? So it saves you typing in all that information. It grabs the family members and just plunks them right in and runs the search. So I'm going to click Ancestry and it's going to do that for me. And it came up with these search results. One thing I do want to comment about other websites, many other genealogy websites will allow users to create trees. In my experience, those trees can be very problematic. They're wonderful for giving you hints about your family and maybe ideas to check out, but they're not reliable most of the time as a solid source of information. What I found, like you've probably found, is that somebody will copy somebody else's tree, errors and all, and then the errors get propagated throughout Ancestry or throughout Find My Past or wherever people are building the tree. It has nothing to do with the website per se. It's just that people are looking for, oh, here's an easy way to copy my family tree, and they just copy it without validating it. And so I found that I do better if I don't look at those when I'm building the tree, unless I really get stumped and I want to look for clues or whatever, like I'm having a hard time finding a source. Maybe it can give me a good hint, but most of the time, Ancestry's search is so good that you don't need to uh, use those more error-prone trees. Now, if you have a tree on Ancestry and you've been so careful about it, please don't take that as a slam against Ancestry trees or anybody's trees. I'm just mentioning that most of the time when I look at these user trees, they do have errors in them. So you do have to be careful. Okay, so what we want to do here is look for the 1841. Remember that we want to go from what we know to discover what we don't know. So here's an 1841, and there's another one underneath. So I'll just start with the first one and see if it looks like it's right. So when I bring it up, what do you know? It's like a perfect match for what we already saw in Family Search. So, and you might be saying, well, then why didn't you just take it from Family Search? And I could have, but let me show you in a minute why I chose to go over to Ancestry. And this is just the way I do it. You could find a different way that works better for you. So I am going to go to this census. I'm going to open up the image and I'm going to start putting the information into the timeline grid. So first of all, at the top, I put in where the enumeration took place. So they're in District 5, North Bearley. I hope that's how you pronounce it. I actually don't know. In Bradford, Yorkshire, etc. Then here's George Hood, age 35. He is an iron laborer. He's born in Yorkshire. The yes actually stands for, were you born in the same county where the census is being taken? And since he was born in Yorkshire, and since the census was taken in Yorkshire, he and his family answered yes to that question. So we know that they were all born in Yorkshire. So there's George, there's Susanna, and then I just put in Thomas because for this grid, we're going to find Thomas's family, and I'm not going to put in all his siblings, but I could build a grid for George and Susanna and all their children. So just in this particular case, I'm wanting to focus on Thomas. So once I've input the information from the census, then I like to, excuse me, I like to put in an approximate birth date just because it gives me a better picture of the family. And you often use the birth year for searches. So it just kind of helps to plug that in, and it's really easy. I just estimated it off the age in the census. Now, some of you might be saying, wait a second, I noticed that you're in the 1841 census. And remember, that's the only English census where they rounded down the ages. And you're absolutely right. And so I just know that this is an estimate right now, which will be adjusted later as necessary. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the rounding in English censuses, they rounded, or excuse me, the 1841 census, they rounded down to the nearest 5. So George could actually be any place from 35 to 39. Susanna could be anything from 45 to 49. However, kids under 15, they were not supposed to round. I do still occasionally, once in a while, see the enumerator even rounding the kids, but most of the time they won't. So 5 is probably accurate for Thomas. Now, this is why I didn't enter the information from Family Tree because, or from the Family Tree source, I should say, because I love Ancestry's suggested records. Look at this. We've got a boatload of possible hints, and there's an 1851 census that has a good chance of being about our Thomas Hood. But this is not exactly an unscripted webinar because I did all this before, but I didn't weed out the errors. So this is the type of thing that you may encounter what I'm about to show you. So I clicked on that 1851 census, fully expecting it to be a valid hint for our Thomas Hood. What do you guys think? I'm going to open up the chat, and if you want to, go ahead and pop in your whether you think this is our Thomas. Yep, Mare, I hope I'm saying your name right. Mare or Mary, she says, nope, it's not. Anne noticed it's not. Yeah, did you guys notice things just aren't lining up? So, for example, we've got here a possible correction to the name, which is Wood instead of Hood. We've got the wrong parents, John and Anne, not George and Susanna. And we've got this guy being born in Lockton rather than in Bradford or North Bearley. So this turned out to be a bogus hint. What I found in Ancestry, their track record, at least in the research I do, is about 80%. So those suggested records on the side, about 80% of the time, they are going to be for the person that you're looking at. But you do have to sanity check them like we did here. So what do you do if the only hint that came up for the census you want, in this case, the 1851, is wrong? Well, let me show you a cool trick that works really well in Ancestry. That is that you find one of the close siblings and you click on them instead. Because here's Susanna, she's only 7. And so there's probably a good chance that she's still with the family in the 1851, and probably Thomas will be too. So when I click Susanna, now this, of course, is the list of household members at the bottom of that, the census results in Ancestry. So I click Susanna, and what that does is it populates her information at the top of the page, and it changes the suggested records to her. And look what we've got here. We've got an 1851 census for Susanna Hood. So we click on that. And now it's looking a lot better. Mom is Susie or Susanna. Sarah Ann, that was an older sibling. Looks like she's married here, got the right age to be married. Then we've got George, Jane, Susanna, and Thomas, who are the 4 siblings that we know about. And of course, you can't see it here, but I also checked the birthplaces and just made sure everything was consistent, and it was. So this turns out to be the right census, and there is Thomas. And he's age 15, which is what we were expecting. So we click his name, and then that pops him back to the top of the census page in Ancestry, and it gives me all fresh hints for Thomas. So now that I've found the right census, I'm going to put in the 1851 information. Sadly, George is deceased because Susie or Susanna is a widow at this point. And so we put in her information and Thomas's information. We've got a little weird thing going on with the age here, and it actually is hard to read, but when I blew it up, it really did look like 13. And so I put 13, but just something that we want to be aware of. And he is a forge boy. So he's working at the iron works in his nearby area. I'm don't want to say it's necessarily in his parish, but it would have to be nearby. So he's in the iron business as his dad was before. His dad was also an iron laborer. Okay, now here's where it gets super exciting. So I look at all these suggested records for our Thomas Hood, and I notice that there's a marriage record. Right off, it's in the right place because it's in Yorkshire. But let's do a little sanity check because, again, not every hint is going to be accurate. Most of them will be, but we've got to check. So what do we expect for a marriage for our Thomas? Well, we'd expect him to get married in or near Bradford, Yorkshire, because it's the mid-1800s. He was an iron laborer, so not well-to-do. So it would be unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that he would go to, London or something to get married. So we're expecting something in the Bradford area. Most men at that time in England got married between 20 and 25. We'd also expect him probably to be an iron worker, since that seemed to be what the family did. His residence from the census, I forgot to point this out, but if we went back to the census, the family's residence was Lowmore. So I would expect the marriage to, or the residence on the marriage record, probably to say Lowmore. And I'd expect his dad to be George, an iron worker. Well, bingo, we have a winner. We totally got what we expected. Since this is a little hard to read, I'll go through it. This does say Bradford. So they got married in the parish of Bradford. We've got Thomas Hood. He's age 22, so he falls in the right age. He's a forgeman, so he's still working at an ironworks business. And his residence is Lowmore. His dad is George Hood, and dear George is a forgeman. So everything lines up. We have now used what we knew to discover what we didn't know, which is who Thomas married. So we have learned that Thomas married Elizabeth Mathers, age 22. She also was from Lowmore, probably not too surprising. And her dad is George Mathers, and he is a mechanic. So then we add the marriage information to the grid. So I put the marriage date here, and I usually link to the source as well. So marriage date and location, and now I can create a row for Elizabeth. Then we go back to suggested records and we say, okay, we've got 41, 51, marriage in 60. Let's try and find the family a year after their marriage in the 1861 census. And here is Thomas. There's a hint. Turns out the hint is right. And there is Thomas. He's 10 years older than he was in 51. He's a hammerman, so he's still working in the iron business. He's got the same parish, got the wife that we would expect. She's the right age. And so see how we're building this picture of Thomas's family. So now you'll probably be relieved to know that we're not going to walk through building every single census on this record, but here is a snapshot of the completed timeline grid. So on the real grid, because I had enough room, I kept the parents at the top. So we've got George, we've got Susanna, then there's Thomas, there's his wife Elizabeth. She passes away between 1891 and 1901. And then we've got the kids. And he does have one more child that wouldn't fit on this screen, but he is in the real timeline grid. So I wanted you to see what it looks like when you get the whole grid completed, and how you can just see what's happening with this family over time. You see that Thomas started as a young boy, got into the iron business, got married, and worked in the iron business all his life, then lost his wife when he was, between 55 and 65. He had these kids. The kids left home at certain times. His daughter Jane married, and they ended up living with her dad. And so that gave me a clue to her family. So do you see how this timeline grid just helped me build a really complete, accurate picture of the family? And it wasn't hard to do. It didn't take a lot of time, but it gave me something accurate to look at and to work with as I start to put this family in Family Tree or whatever program you're using. So we are now to step 3, where we review the information. And again, this is a very similar situation. I am going to point out that one inconsistency that we talked about before is that here he's 5, then he's 13, then he's 23. So he should have been 3 in the census, right? If these ages are right. But then he kind of switches back. Well, back then, it's important not to get too hung up on years. If they're like 5 or 10 years off, then I'm worried. But if they're maybe, 1 or 2 years off, honestly, back then in the 1800s, it wasn't that big of a deal, especially for people that didn't have the chance for an education, as my Thomas didn't. He was an iron worker. So he probably had like awesome strength and great muscles and so forth. He had skills in his livelihood, but he didn't have the opportunity for an education. So when someone asked him how old he was, especially when he was older, he might not have specifically known. And so everything else lines up. So because everything else lined up, the same kids born in the same place, the same enumeration information, I felt confident that even though there were couple little anomalies with the age, it wasn't enough to make me think I had the wrong person. Now, if one of these said, like Thomas Hood, 25 Worcestershire, then I'd be worried. I'd go, wait a second. Why is he in Yorkshire all the time except in 1861? And why is his age dramatically different? See, those are the kind of red flags that we want to look at and resolve. Well, we want to resolve all of them really, but those kind of red flags, they're serious, indicate that we may have the wrong person. And so if we do, then we want to resolve that, of course, before entering the information into Family Tree. So we're now to step 4, which is actually to put the people in. And I am going to assume that most or all of you know how to enter people into Family Tree or into whatever program you use. So we're not going to go step by step, but I did just want to make a few comments. When I started to search or started to add actually Elizabeth Mathers as Thomas's wife, a duplicate or a match came up. Because I had carefully researched her, because I knew her maiden name, I knew her birthplace, I knew her approximate birth year, and also when I popped into earlier censuses, it was easy to find her parents. And remember, we knew her dad was George from the marriage certificate. So because I came with that context, when I found this Elizabeth Mathers, it was easy to tell that she was the right person. And she actually had been added to Family Tree from her christening record. So that's why she was already in there, but she wasn't connected to Thomas. So in the case of Elizabeth, I just connected her to Thomas, but then the other kids were not already in Family Tree, and I was able to add them. And then, of course, the last thing we want to do is attach the sources. Family Search has made it so easy to attach sources. I love this. So you remember I said that the suggested records in Ancestry, when you're researching a person, they tend, in my experience, to be about 80% correct. These hints in Family Search have a higher accuracy rate, but you tend to get fewer of them. And that's always the trade-off. So if you want more accuracy, you're going to get fewer records. If you loosen up the accuracy, you're going to get more records, but all of them may not be correct. Well, now that I've put all of Thomas's information in, particularly his wife and children, I can expect to get some really good hints up there. So I'm going to I'm going to verify and then attach all these hints. These are the low-hanging fruit. And most of these are going to be about your person. Then you want to look for other Family Search records by clicking the logo and doing a search. And the reason I recommend attaching Family Search historical records first is that Family Search pretty much guarantees that the source links will not break. Other sites do not, and frankly shouldn't be expected to make that guarantee. That I've seen Ancestry's links change over the years. I've seen Find My Past links change. They may have various reasons. They come up with a better structure or whatever it may be. So those links may change, but Family Search, you can pretty much guarantee, as much as humans can, that those links will stay valid. So that's why I always try to attach the Family Search version of a census or whatever source before I do the others. If I can't find it in Family Search Historical Records, then I will attach the other source. And as it happens, I could not find that marriage record in Family Search Historical Records, so I went ahead and attached it from Ancestry. So that brings us to the end of filling out the grid, and let's just talk about some common questions that come up when using the timeline grid. One of the biggest is, will it take me a long time to learn? Well, the truth is, just like anything, there's a learning curve. There's always going to be a learning curve, but I found that this is one of the simpler templates to use, especially if you've already used census records. So you kind of know how they work. And you come to the table and it's very obvious that there's a column for every census and a row for every person. So in my experience, you'll probably come up to speed after making like maybe your first one or two grids. What I would recommend if you're doing this for the first time, start with a simple family. Like don't start with a family that's got multiple marriages or strange situations where uh, what's an example where the children have an unexpected birthplace and you're not sure if there's, what's going on, or if the child has an unexpected name or whatever it might be. Don't go for those complicated ones right at first. Just choose a simple one where it's mom, dad, and kids, and they're easy to plug into the grid. And then also we've got, like I mentioned, some other webinars on the timeline grid, and they are available on this timeline grid page on goldenrodgenealogy.com. How long does it take to finish a grid? Glad you asked. So it depends on the complexity of the family, the difficulty of reading the handwriting, and so forth. But a good average is about 1 to 1.5 hours. And when you think about that tiny investment of time to research a family thoroughly, that's really pretty amazing in my mind. So you've spent that hour and 30 minutes, whatever, to really be sure that you've found the right mother's maiden name. You found all the kids. Oh, that's a thing I forgot to mention. On that completed grid that I showed you, I actually went to English civil registration and found the civil birth registrations for each of the kids so that I verified their mother's maiden name and also knew when and where they were born. It kind of backed up the census. So I wanted to make sure, just one more source that helps me be confident that I've got accurate information. So with this tiny investment of time, you can come up with something really, really accurate that you can use to enter information in your tree. Can I add the timeline grid as a source in Family Tree? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. So you can go to the profile, to the person's sources tab, and there's two ways that you can add that as a source. One is to turn the timeline grid into a PDF and just attach it. And so you can add it as a memory, and then you can create a memory source. But then also now when you create a source, you have the option to upload something without going to your memory tab. Some of you might be familiar with that. It ends up in your memory tab, but you don't actually have to go there to add the source. So just when it says, do you want to upload a file or attach a file, then you can do that PDF. The other thing you can do is link to an online grid. So I do all my online grids in Google Drive. So I just create a link straight to my timeline grid. So basically, here's a visual on that. You go to the sources tab and then you click add source, and then you can either upload, like I said, upload the file or add a link. And then when you do, the timeline grid shows up as a source, and I will generally date them to the birth date of the main person on the grid. And it doesn't show here, but I actually made this a span. So if you open up this source, it actually says from 1836, excuse me, 1836 to 1911, because that's the latest source that I had. That's as far as I had found family information. And this question always comes up. Okay, great if you're working in a country and time period with censuses, but what if I'm doing research in a country and time period that doesn't have censuses? For example, before 1841 in England, at least that's when they started using names on censuses. For the US, it's 1851. Well, I've played around with this and I actually haven't found anything that I really totally like yet that seems to work. So here's, if you're working in that kind of a time period, here's something you could consider. So we keep the first column for the ID and vitals. Then you could just have birth, marriage, and death because those are usually the key events that got documented prior to the census. And then you could have another column for notes or wills or land records or whatever you may find. So, and the final question, where can I get the free templates? And the answer to that is to visit the Timeline Grid information and templates page. And Olivia said that she would add this to the YouTube thing, but let me go back there and see if I can grab copy link address. I bet I could put this in the chat. And this will not help people who are viewing the webinar, the recorded webinar, which is why Olivia is going to add them to the YouTube page. But for those of you who are on the call today, there is the link to the Timeline Grid page. So that brings us to the end of our webinar today. So just by way of summary, the Timeline Grid is a simple free research log or template that helps you organize information, improve accuracy, and use what you know to discover what you don't know. We saw that illustrated on a walkthrough, and then we answered some frequently asked questions. So thank you everybody so much for coming today. And Olivia, do we have any questions to address?
Jean, I can unmute you 1 second.
Hi, my question is, when will we be able to see this recording again? So much wonderful information, but a little bit over, I just like to review it once again.
Oh, absolutely, Jean. Yeah, it is a lot. We do pack a lot into these webinars knowing that they'll be recorded. So yeah, Olivia, correct me if I'm wrong, but Olivia, don't you usually post the recording by the following week, about Wednesday, I want to say?
It should be up by next Monday.
Oh, wow, faster than I said. So up by
Okay.
next Monday. Thank you,
Thank
Jean.
you so much. I appreciate that because I had done kind of like a timeline myself that was like this. And
Yeah.
I thought this is much, much better. So I appreciate not having to reinvent the wheel. Thank you, Kathryn.
You're sure welcome, Jean. Thank you for your comments. I'm glad it was helpful. And any other questions that anybody has? And I see kind comments in the chat. You guys, thank you so much. I'm glad if this was helpful. That was the hope. Let's see, Gordon just said, when adding a source, it doesn't seem to let you add the file and a link in the same source. Oh, interesting, Gordon. I didn't realize that. Thank you. So what Gordon is talking about there, you guys, as some of you, for those of you who have the chat open, in Family Search, when you create a source, you can either upload a file or do a link. And I didn't realize that you couldn't do both, but I guess that kind of makes sense because why would you upload a file if you had a link? But I hadn't even thought that far ahead. Unfortunately, Gordon did. So just know that if you're going to attach a file, you can't do a link and vice versa. Oh, Shirley, thank you. Glad it was helpful. And yeah, you'll probably enjoy watching the recording when it's posted next week. Shirley, for those of you who don't have the chat open, Shirley was only able to make it 30 minutes into the webinar. And so let's see. Oh, Kathy says, if there's time, I'd love to see how you add the link. Oh my goodness, let me look at the time. So this was only supposed to go for an hour, and Olivia, we've still got 5 minutes. Are you okay with me demonstrating how to add a link?
Yeah, for sure. No
Okay,
problem.
awesome. Let me get, Kathy, I'm so glad you asked that. Let me escape out of full screen mode and move the Zoom menu thingy and go back over to the timeline grid. So the way I created it, let me just wait, where is, oh, this what that was on Ann Gunton's, wasn't it? Shoot. So I'll tell you what, the process of creating a link is the same no matter where. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab this link here. I'm going to copy it. Wait. And I'm going to delete it so we can actually walk through the process of adding it back. So let's see, I'm going to break that link. So suppose that I had found, in fact, let me do it. Let me put the link over here. So I am in Ancestry and I've got this census up on the screen and I want to link to this census in my timeline grid. So what I do first of all is I copy this link. You notice when I clicked in it, it automatically selected the whole link. It turned it blue, which means that it's kind of marked to the computer saying, I'm going to do something with this. So then you can right click and choose copy. Now, suppose you clicked in and it didn't select it. Well, then if you hit copy, there's really nothing to copy. So you do want to select the whole thing. If you're a keyboard person, the keyboard shortcut for that is Control A. That's if you're on a Windows machine. If you're on a Mac, it's Command A, is my understanding. But did you notice when I I didn't click, I pressed Control A, it selected the whole URL. So I'm going to copy that and then I'm going to go back to my timeline grid. And here I have the text that I want to turn into a link. It's the text that says image 354. That happens to be the number of the image on Ancestry. So then once I've selected this text, then I right click here. And notice it gives me, well, I'm going to have to move the Zoom menu out of the way. Sorry about that. Let me go back here. So I am selecting this text, then I'm right clicking on the selected text and I am choosing insert link. If you're a keyboard person, you actually don't even have to right click. You can just choose Control K. Both of those things will bring you up this dialog box, I guess you could call it. And it's saying, what link do you want to link to? Well, I copied the link earlier, right? So now I'm going to paste it in. And there's that link that we grabbed from Ancestry. And then there's going to be an apply button. So I click apply. And it has now created the link. And so when I want to click the link in Google Docs, it's a little different. You click it and then it brings up like this preview and then you have to click it again. If you use Microsoft Word for your, oh, you guys, sorry, I have had like the worst cold and I'm just getting over it. So I appreciate your tolerance, but I had a little bit of a cough here. So if you're in Microsoft Word, you have to do Control click. So you don't get this little preview thing. You just do Control click and it'll take you to the URL. So Kathy, I hope that helps. And please let us know if you had questions. And do we have any other questions in the chat? And I am also, so Jean, I see that you've raised your hand and it may just be left over from the other question. But if you have another question, please feel free to put it in the chat to let us know.
Okay. I was wondering if I could just unmute myself. My
Yeah.
question is, can you, are these templates that you can type in as you go, or I guess they would be, wouldn't they? Okay.
Yeah, but you know what I found, Jean, is that if one person has this question, pretty much everybody on the call, or like at least half the people do. So to answer your question, yeah, these are not protected in any way. And actually, that does bring up a good point. I have a master template. Well, let me come over here and I'll show you. When you go to the Goldenrod page that has the templates, you scroll down here and let's just say we wanted the legal US template. So we click that to open it up. This template is the master and it cannot be edited. So you brought up a really good point there. What you want to do for the Google Drive template is you click File, and these instructions are on the website, by the way, but as long as we're here, I'll just demonstrate it. You click File and you click Make a Copy, and then it saves it to your own Google Drive. You can rename it, whatever you want it to be, My Timeline Grid. And you can even say where you want to save it. So you can put it in your drive, or you can choose a subfolder or whatever it might be. But yeah, so the Google Drive templates are not immediately editable, but you just save yourself a copy and then you can edit it to your heart's content.
Cool. Thank
So
you.
thank you. Thanks for asking that, because I forgot to mention that. Anything else, my friends? Hey, Olivia, it looks like we're done with the questions, so I'll turn the time back over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on April 20th with James Tanner. He will be giving a presentation entitled Crossing the Border, Finding Your Immigrant Ancestors. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.